Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this Fringe meeting on challenging history, our attempts to confront the past, explanation or erasure. I'm Trevor Phillips. I'm the chair of the History Matters project at Policy Exchange. We conceived of the History Matters project at the beginning of the summer, obviously in the light of many of the public debates about the nature and essentially the ownership of history. The aims of our project are very simple, twofold. First of all, to record the various ways in which the topic is being approached by local authorities, schools, museums, universities, publishers, the media owners of stately homes, charities, and indeed the average person in the street, because this has become a topic of much public discussion. And secondly, I hope what we're going to do more of today, to bring together some of our best minds to try to work out as a society what we do to manage the historical legacy in the light of two things. First of all, fresh knowledge and the insights that we gain from that fresh knowledge, because there are things that we know about our past, and then there are things that we learn about our past that we didn't know before. Secondly, in the light of changing demographics and changing mores. The truth is, though we can't move the mountain that is certainly the history of this country, we can always view it from different perspectives and from different altitudes up the mountain. So the process by which we change our view, change our perspective, and so on, itself is in dispute. We've got a very distinguished panel with us. Dr. Amanda Foreman, best known, I think, as the author of Georgiana, the Duchess of Devonshire. Dr. Samir Shah, the chief executive of Juniper Productions, but actually also a previous deputy chair at the V&A, and now chair of the Jeffrey Museum, which has recently has its own story in this area. Tarjinder Gill, who is a primary school teacher, and I think she'll be embarrassed for me to say this, but a distinguished and sparky writer on the challenge that faces everybody who is trying to explain the historical record or carry the historical record to children, perhaps the biggest battleground of all. And last but not least, Chris Skidmore, previously the Minister for Universities and Science, and himself a distinguished historian. I think your last book was on Richard III, if I'm not mistaken, Chris. I'm going to ask Amanda to start us off in a moment. Each of our speakers has 5 minutes or so. Then I'll ask them a few questions of my own, and then I'll come to all of you. And I hope that people will be putting in their questions in the usual way. We all know about the events that have taken place over this summer. For many people, this all started with the Colston episode in Bristol, but of course, even in recent times, this has been going back to the arguments over Rhodes' statue in Oriel and so on. But there are many, many points at which we could start that discussion. Essentially, the question of symbols, language, monuments, what they tell us about our history, how we interpret them, and how we change those interpretations if we mean to. We think at Policy Exchange that the past really, really matters. The way I think about this is the distinguished medical historian Roy Porter once wrote that the historical record is like the night sky. We see a few stars and group them together into mythic constellations, but what is chiefly visible is the darkness. And what Roy was really saying was that the people and events we sometimes call history are not in and of themselves a reality. They're simply pointers to the forces that shaped our world. And the historical record has a value in that it reminds us of the places that we visited before and perhaps points to those wider forces. But the importance of that historical record is that it tells us about the journeys we've made, and hopefully shows us some of the cul-de-sacs we've been up so we don't go up them again. And also it helps us prepare for the voyage of the future. We also know that we learn things that change our view of history. Back in 1650, Bishop James Ussher, who was by no means an unsophisticated man, he was a well-known astronomer, a follower of Galileo. He decided to establish the age of the Earth, and he did that by counting all of the generations recorded in the Bible, and decided that the Earth came into being in the year 4004 BC. We often talk about Ussher as a sort of medieval nut job, but actually it's worth saying that many people at the time took a similar view. The Venerable Bede argued with Ussher only about the starting date. Bede thought it was 3952, and Isaac Newton thought it wasn't 4004, it was 3998. Now, since then, we think we've learned something, and we think that they were a bit out by about 4.5 billion years, but who knows? Maybe we'll learn something more in the future. But my point here is that we learn about our past. There are new things we find out about our past, and every time we do so, we have to think, how do we manage the recognition? How do we understand the change? We know that some people would like to adopt the French Revolution style, i.e. start all over again. 1792, I think it is, becomes year one, or Cambodia. 1975 becomes year zero. But I hope that, for my own part, that's not where we're going. I hope that part of our discussion today is to think, how do we manage these issues? How do we do them in a way that brings the whole public together, creates an open and generous and fruitful discussion rather than a divisive one? So with that, let me turn to our first contributor, Amanda Foreman.
Thank you very much, Trevor. And it's a great honour to be part of this distinguished panel. And thank you very much to Policy Exchange for including me. And in particular, to talk about this particular topic, which, as Trevor was saying before we began off screen, is incredibly emotive. And the elephant in the room is that very often we don't wish to acknowledge just how emotive this topic is. And yet we have to, because the practice of removing statues is part of something that we can call culturecide. And it's been going on for thousands of years. And whether we look at recent examples of the destruction of Palmyra, or the destruction that was rained upon Dubrovnik, or the Banyamin Buddhist statues, those were assaults on a common thread, which is what Trevor was talking about, that our cultural icons are part of a story that we put together that tells us something about ourselves, where we came from, and where we're going to. And assaults on that story, whether they are right or wrong assaults, nevertheless make people highly emotive. And if you don't accept the fact that this is an emotive topic, people feel very, very strongly, and that there are good reasons for feeling strongly, then it becomes difficult to have an honest discussion about it. So I think it's okay for people to be upset, to possibly even lose their temper, because we're talking about something incredibly important. And even though the things themselves, statues, icons, are tangible, the feelings are intangible and sometimes hard to put into words and articulate clearly. And the reason I say this is because this debate goes to extremes very, very quickly. Either it's one must never take down any statue ever, or frankly, whenever any group, any minority, even a minority of one, starts to have an objection, that objection should be taken into account, and something that's deemed offensive should be removed or destroyed. And you know, it's you can take anything to an extreme. For example, I think that transplants are a very good thing, and yet in China, it's known that political prisoners can be executed and have their organs transplanted. So that's a very bad thing. So obviously, we shouldn't have transplants in all cases, in all circumstances, organized by all countries. So there are limits to any conversation, any discussion about what we consider to be generally a good thing, and questioning our icons and our statues and our outside art and inside art that's connected to our history and culture. There's nothing wrong with asking ourselves, is this still relevant? Does this speak to our times as well as the time in which it was created? And sometimes those answers are going to be not the ones that we were expecting. But I think it's important that we don't forget that very often the whole point about removing or taking down a statue was to attack, to destroy, humiliate, intimidate. For example, the Romans with their damnatio memoriae, it was a way of ending conversations, not starting them. And to ignore that, to ignore the fact that Hatshepsut, Egypt's greatest female pharaoh, was eradicated from history for over 2,000 years, systematically and on purpose, in order to create a different conversation, in order to create a different history and a different myth and story about Egypt at the time. And not to remember those factors is not just a disservice to history, but a kind of self-deception and lying. So we have to always be on alert for asking ourselves, why are we talking about a particular statue or a particular icon? And for example, in 2010, the statue of Stalin was removed from his hometown in Gori, Georgia, at the request of the inhabitants. And I don't think anyone would argue against removing Stalin's statue. It provoked bad feelings. It reminded the Georgians of a particular terrible time in their lives. And I would argue that that is similar to some of the discussions we've been having about statues in Britain and in the US, about how sensitivities change and how a local population's wishes should very much be taken into account, even though Gori did happen to be Stalin's birthplace. But sometimes the nuance isn't taken into account, or it's so difficult that people would rather not discuss it at all. And I would, for example, bring in the recent events at Princeton University, where the two-term US President Woodrow Wilson was also president of Princeton University, and his name was on one of the residential colleges, and on the was the Woodrow Wilson School of Foreign Policy. And a couple of months ago, his name was removed from both on the grounds of his segregationist views. And if you look at the public record, there's no doubt that Woodrow Wilson was an out-and-out segregationist, the same way that FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was an out-and-out anti-Semite. And these are particularly troubling and ugly characteristics of great men. Woodrow Wilson really fought for the right to self-determination, and his plan for a fairer, greater international community does him great credit. So when we concentrate on one aspect of somebody at the expense of the thing that they achieved, or the thing that they're celebrated for, it's sometimes an incredibly blunt instrument that doesn't get to the heart of what we're really discussing. And not only that, it can also be used as a way to further a political agenda. So, for example, Margaret Sanger, the pioneering campaigner for women's rights, not just for their political rights, but in terms of rights to their body, for birth control in particular, and she's famous for funding the pill, was also a eugenicist when she was much younger in the 1930s. And that has been used against her and against the women's movement in particular and abortion rights by Christian fundamentalists as a way of pulling down the whole movement. And so we have to always be vigilant about asking why is something being agitated for, and not just whether it is a good thing in itself. Cui bono is what I'm suggesting here, because otherwise what you lose isn't just a piece of history. For example, when crowds pulled down Michelangelo's statue of Pope Julius II in the 16th century, something important culturally and artistically was lost as well. And it's so easy to lose things in the moments of time by using a blunt instrument of spray paint and chains or ropes or whatever it is to make a political statement. And what in fact you're doing is that you're using history as a morality play, and you're substituting political action for performative action. So at the end of the day, my message is that nothing is sacrosanct. All statues, all icons should be subject to rigorous discussion and forensic examination of what their worth is. But at the same time, I would argue that we shouldn't mistake the culture wars that go on continuously for political action. Trevor, you're on mute.
Sorry, all I said was Samir, but he's unmuted already.
Okay, thank you, Trevor. What I'll do is just recount briefly this my engagement with this issue. As you said, I'm the chair of what was called the Jeffrey Museum. It's now called the Museum of the Home. After the Colston statue was pulled down, there was a campaign called Topple the Statues movement. And in that list of statues, they identified Sir Robert Jeffrey, after which the museum had been named. That's because Robert Jeffrey was a 17th century merchant who had donated the almshouses to the city, and the almshouses now house the collection of the Museum of the Home. But because it was in the list to be taken down, because he was a merchant who had links to the slave trade, had made some money out of the slave trade, there was a campaign to pull it down. That took off pretty massively in June and July, and we considered at the board whether we should or should not do so. We decided at the board to adopt the policy of retain and explain, which Trevor, you've called explain, not erasure. It was the stated policy of Historic England. It was also the stated policy of DCMS and Secretary of State. And we went overwhelmingly to retain and explain. That created a furore amongst local community organizations, campaigners, various partners of the museum. It's in Hoxton. And that engendered a really very toxic atmosphere around the museum. As a result, we decided that we would review our decision, because whether it was right or wrong, what was clear was the consequence of this activism against the museum. There was a small demonstration that we got past the point of whether we should bring it down or not bring it down, but it was derailing the museum's opening plans and its future. I was extremely concerned about this because it appeared that we were going to take an action which was driven by political activism. And that's the motivation to take it down. I completely agree with you, Amanda, that of course we must never say nothing gets taken down ever, but we do need to look into why it's being taken down, what the basis and what the motivation is. I personally don't think as a museum we should do things that are anything other than curatorially driven. This was not curatorially driven. We had, for example, changed the name from the Jeffrey Museum to the Museum of the Home because the Jeffrey Museum didn't really tell anybody what the museum was about. And we thought Museum of the Home was a more effective way of letting people know, broadening our reach. So I was perfectly content to take the name Jeffrey off the museum. It was a curatorially driven one. This wasn't. This was a activist campaign where some of the activists who were our partners had withdrawn their support. So it was very damaging for us. So we were reviewing it. What struck me about this business, which is, of course, as we all know, contested history, you can have arguments on both sides, was that we were left in a situation where there was no, if we took the statue down, changed our decision in other words, there seemed to be, at least we get these actors off our back and the museum would be back on track. And there seemed to be no cost attached to taking the statue down. Why don't we just do it? I was very concerned about an action that had no cost attached to it. And I raised this matter with various people, including Secretary of State, to say that whenever you make a decision like this, you must make the decision knowing that there's a price to be paid for any decision, how we carry things and what we do. In the event, I have to say, Secretary of State was very clear about it and about both in terms of he's feeling unable to support a decision or suggest to the taxpayer who funds the museum that we take an action based on the activities of local political protest. And of course, we were also, the demand was also affecting what is a grade 1 listed building. In the event, we didn't, we chose to continue to review it, and that is the current position. What strikes me about this is that whilst it is entirely reasonable to think about what we should do with a statue, it does not seem to be reasonable to make decisions based on political activism. I think we should take it, we should do it in a more neutral manner, if that's the right word, where we discuss the arguments for and against, as you were suggesting, Amanda, and what is the right thing to do, but clear of being pushed in one direction or the other through political motivation. I found that really difficult, and I found ourselves in a place where it was difficult to resist because of this. And I thought, in policy exchange terms, that there was a gap in our policy formulations that allowed this. I think if we are to change, if we are to do something like take a statue down, we need to have a process, a rigorous process by which such a decision is taken. Because these are irreversible decisions and they need to be taken cognizant that this is forever and we're not responding to some immediate concern. It should stand the test of time. And it would be useful for us to discuss what would make a good argument that stands the test of time and does not respond to an immediate campaign. I do think there needs to be democratic legitimacy to this. We need to think hard about what is the right approach, the right way to discuss whether we take down a statue or keep it. We, as far as I was concerned, were just taking one approach, which was a perfectly mainstream approach of retaining and explaining. My own personal view is that is the right approach. I think I'd much rather tell the fuller story than to erase it out altogether, to hide it away. I think it's important. I think it's a legitimate argument that we have in our history, not necessarily to tell the full story, and we've told only part of the story. And I have no arguments against telling the fuller story. I do have a difficulty where instead of telling the fuller story, we just hide the story away. And it would be, it seems to me, a disservice if we take out all references to Robert Jeffrey, take out his statue, take everything out, so we suddenly don't even know the history of these armed houses, how they came to be, and we are therefore poorer for it. So my own view about contested history is that we should tell the proper, full, rounded story of any individual case, but we shouldn't hide it away or erase it. And it's been a very tense situation at the Jeffrey. It's not resolved yet, but it seems to me that the way these things have been discussed is not proper. They've been discussed in terms of campaigns and politics, whereas it should be discussed in a more academic, neutral, curatorial way.
Thank you, Samir. Tarjinder.
Thank you, Trevor, and thank you to Policy Exchange for this as well. I've been sort of looking at it more from the perspective of a classroom teacher. So there is an assumption that the past is being confronted in some way in the present that needs to happen. This primarily comes from the idea that we have been denying the past in a systematic way, which is causing societal problems today. From the perspective of a classroom teacher, much of this debate consists of what has or has not been taught on the curriculum. The teaching of school history in this country encompasses local, British and world history in a broadly chronological order. We have a very loose, not a prescriptive curriculum in all subjects, including history, and this is forgotten at times. So while the general content is decided at national level, the specific content is decided at local level. And in many ways decided by history content resource providers because teachers are incredibly time poor. Until 1988, there was no national curriculum and therefore no actual history curriculum that had to be taught all across the country. Pre-national curriculum decisions were left solely to teachers and schools. And so whatever we learnt would have been very, very varied. Since the national curriculum, there have been broad categories of history taught from early years to A-level. But again, there is a lot of choice. So the fact that empire and the transatlantic slave trade, which are primarily but not exclusively focused on in terms of omission, may not have been taught, which seems implausible, is still a possibility. And it would, if that's happened, it's because of the particular selections made at every stage based by the individual schools, and there's no sense in which they would have linked up. So I'm not saying that there is no truth to the claim that maybe certain history has been omitted. But the problem that we have is to what extent these selections have occurred to create the impression that only white history is being taught. We don't know because there isn't actually research in the area. And so one of my issues is that actually a lot of claims are being made by academics and activists about what teachers are doing about school history from quite an ideological perspective of racialized history. And yet they don't really they don't actually give the evidence for it other than anecdotes. And even these anecdotes have not actually been verified. So we don't know for sure. It's quite simple, it's quite easy for people to have learned things, for example, in Key Stage 1 and 2 have completely forgotten about them. So unless we actually look at the content anybody was actually taught, we can't say for certain what has and has not been happening. Also, there does seem to be a particular issue coming from I think private schools in particular, where there seems to be a sort of, a sense that there's a much more sort of colonial history being taught without different interpretations. Now, again, we can't really say whether this is true or not. In most cases, good practice in history would involve teaching different interpretations of any historical period. And that's true even in primary school, even if we do it in a simpler way. My own experiences of history teaching included being taught about empire in Australia in year 4, empire and slavery in year 6, the civil rights movement and apartheid in year 8, and the contributions of soldiers from the empire in both world wars, as well as the beginnings of the Commonwealth. Now, this might not satisfy the demands being called for today, but it's still quite remarkable given the claims that some were taught nothing at the time or even today. So it just goes to show how varied it might be. There may very well be people who feel like they've not been taught anything about the contributions of anybody but white people on the curriculum. And then you have others who would have much more varied experience. But all schools have to make decisions about teaching history within the remit of the national curriculum. And I do think that we have an abundance of history problem, and this, I think, is ignored at times. We have more recorded history than can ever be taught in the time that we have to teach it. Therefore, choices have to be made. The idea that we are avoiding confronting history or erasing it or deliberately omitting certain people, for example, the Black Tudors, in order to pretend that the history of this country was white and that no other groups lived here just doesn't ring true. Instead, it seems to me that we have to make choices, and those choices may seem racialised, but are not in reality. The fact that we live in a country that has, since the earliest settlement, been majority white by dint of history and not design is no different to any other country where the majority are of a different colour. This matters because those who want to confront history often use this as their basis for attack on the history curriculum. Yet what they don't seem to acknowledge is that the history of all nations around the world is dominated by royalty and those in power in the past, which was based on the race of the vast majority of the population. Those who claim foul when, again, say, certain Black or Asian people have not been taught throughout history, rarely say the same, or because, instead we focus on kings and queens, rarely say the same when we take ancient Egyptians largely by the history of the pharaohs, or say when we look at the Mughal period in India, we put the Mughal centre stage. Even royalty and power does not gain one automatic inclusion into the history curriculum. So while the Black tutors may not feature on the curriculum in many schools, neither does Cleopatra, for example. And I haven't included her on my current ancient Egyptian unit that I'm teaching. This is not a racialized decision. It's just true that I could have spent one less lesson on the Egyptian gods and goddesses in favour of Cleopatra. But I think the beliefs and deities followed by the people during that period explains more historically and in terms of the different religions that emerged in that region than just teaching about one particular ruler. And let's look at the actual requirements of history teaching. Is there a basis for teaching any of the units or any of the people that we're talking about? And where do they fit? Is it continuity and change? Is it change, cause, and consequence? Are we looking at this particular period so that we can use them to make connections, draw contrasts, or analyse trends? These arguments that are actually central to the creation of a history curriculum are just don't seem to appear when the activists start talking. Instead, they seem to be making lots of claims about their need for representation. And this then takes it away from being about history or the history curriculum, the teaching of the subject, into a different realm. Some of it is kind of narcissistic, but there's also other claims that are quite questionable about the impact that teaching certain history units would have on self-esteem or on outcomes for certain groups. But I'd argue that since 1988, various schools have taught Black History Month. And I've taught in various schools which have included this. And yet I can't claim that I've seen or any research that states or that can show that it has had any actual impact on the self-esteem of the pupils or indeed on their outcomes. There is more to this. So if this has nothing to do with the history curriculum, the teaching of history, then what is it that people really want? And is the history curriculum the right place to get this? Also, we can't actually satisfy the individual demands of every activist. We have to make decisions about what to include or exclude. It can be assumed that these decisions are racialized, but without actually looking at the overall curriculum and looking at the ideas behind the curriculum and why it is that certain strands and certain units are being picked, I don't think it's acceptable as a criticism to say that we are automatically excluding or including any particular group. And I do think that if the problem is that some people feel that when we do teach about Black or Asian people that it's tokenistic. Well, the claims that, or the kind of things that the activists want us to do now is entirely tokenistic. Like I said, it doesn't link into the history curriculum at all. So it's not helpful. So unless we have a discussion about history and the curriculum as a whole, we're just going to end up in the same place and have the same issues again. But I do think that to some extent, when people are talking about the inclusion of their own books, one has to say, well, are certain academics just engaging in a kind of power play for themselves to be included on the curriculum and using this as a means to do that? And I think we have to be very sceptical about that. I think we still have to retain our own professional judgment on what we teach and why we teach it.
Sorry, Tarjinder, thank you very much. And finally, but not last, nor least, or anything like that, Chris Skidmore.
Thank you, Trevor, and thanks for the opportunity to speak at this event this afternoon. I think I'd echo Amanda said at the beginning that it's welcome in a way that there is such a passion being played out over this debate, and that for me it's welcome that history is now full square in focus after a long period when we've seen a decline in sort of particular entire areas in the country simply not taking history GCSE. And I hope that this can be harnessed for a positive way, particularly in localities like mine. I'm from Bristol. I went to Colston School, and hopefully be able to see, actually this capture the imaginations of schools and colleges for the future. But at the same time, I think we've got to guard against a worrying risk, and that is the risk of creating a new kind of discipline, counter-discipline within history of woke history. For myself, actually the very core discipline of the historical profession is potentially at threat here if woke history takes hold. Trevor, you mentioned at the beginning that inspiring quote by Roy Porter about the stars that shine out through the darkness of what is known and what is not known. And it's always the case that history is the study of the past that survives, not simply the study of the past, and recognizing the ultimate compromises that you have to make as a historian with the historical records you are given, and making sure that's still front and center of any attempt to be able to establish a counter-narrative argument. What is happening at the moment must be based on the historical record. My hobby at the moment is writing a biography of Henry VII, and I go through the Anglo-American legal tradition records online that are at the University of Houston, going through KB9s, KB27s. I'd always passionately advocate that there is plenty of written evidence still there in the National Archives in Kew, for example, for the United Kingdom, to be able to find new stars, to be able to be that historian, astronomer, and actually look up and find evidence that's able to light up the past in new ways we've not been able to do so. And I hope that focusing again, a renewed focus on the remains of the past will come of this. So that in a way, what I'd love to be able to see establishing itself out on the back of this interest, a renewed interest in slavery and the legacy of the slave trade, is some kind of sort of Yad Vashem equivalent that would be able to really preserve historical records of individuals who were either involved in the slave trade, looking at those merchants' records, looking at those admiralty records, or even those individuals who themselves were slaves. I mean, we've seen Miranda Kaufman's book on the Black Tudors and what she was able to do by sort of teasing out information on John Blank, for instance, who was obviously one of the sort of first Black Tudors to be at court, who may not have been because we don't know what came before, but obviously using sort of College of Arms records to show his role as a trumpeter within Henry VII's court, and then making that transition to Henry VIII's court. The second issue I have with the creation of woke history is the so-called golden thread narrative that is created out of history. And we've been here before. We've had Whig history in the past. We've had radical histories by Marxists such as C.P. Hill or Eric Hobsbawm. Obviously, we've had cyclical histories such as the history of civilizations by Philip Toynbee. And obviously, the risk about those histories is that they begin to look at weaving the evidence to fit certain arguments and to be able to fit certain perspectives. As we know, that should absolutely always be, the one thing as a historian you should be focusing on what the past will tell us by itself. And I would say that the past is offensive. Actually, the study of the past can shock and it can offend. I think I vividly remember opening up my GCSE textbook to see a photo of naked bodies piled up outside Auschwitz after liberation by US troops, and being shocked by seeing that photo. But it was right that I was able to see that wasn't somehow suppressed. And it's right also that we don't suppress the ability to challenge assumptions and also to continue to ask questions. And that's my other sort of real gripe I have against this formative woke history, is it begins on certain assumptions that are then not challenged. And that's the absolute opposite of what the historian's tasks should be. So one example might be, did slavery cause the wealth of the UK and the US over centuries? And there seems to be an assumption now, whether it's propagated in the New York Times 1619 project of slavery, or when you look at certain new capitalism schools like Sven Beckhardt, that the radical fringes have been able to actually go against potentially what is the understanding of economic historians, that's not the case. But actually, it's very difficult now to be able to make a counter-argument to some of the populist arguments that have been put out there. And I'd say also that when it comes from a university's perspective, looking at individuals like Nigel Biggar, who were keen to look at the study of empire in the round, to be able to ask honest questions about what were the benefits economically for certain countries around empire, has now actually been shut down from actually being able to perform some of those schools, to be able to have some of those students to be able to study those modules, because it's seen as simply being a topic that is either too risque or too comfortable. And I think that's tragic for the study of history in our institutions. And I would say that when it comes to our universities and institutions, also museums as cultural hubs, the real challenge here is not to fall down into the sort of symbolic gestures, but to understand also that when it comes to racial injustices, they are here today. We had the racial disparity audit run from the Cabinet Office, which demonstrated that there was the BME attainment gap at universities. So if you take a black male and a white male who both get exactly the same A-level results at university, actually, by the time we get to third year and they are taking their finals, the results between those two individuals have widened, so that the black male is roughly 17 percentage points behind the white male. And that in itself, that inequality, I think, is something universities need to focus on as civic institutions, by focusing on disadvantage now rather than thinking about disadvantage in the past and putting too many resources into that for the past. I know that most people popularize this debate because it all becomes about statues, because they're visual, because we're able to then see Colston being ripped down. And I would say there weren't many black people actually pulling down that Colston statue. And my worry is that when we look at what is happening here, the ultimate white privilege is individuals who are performing these performative acts, because obviously it makes them somehow feel more comfortable about their own existence and be able to define their own individual identities going forwards to the future. But that isn't what history is about. And obviously when it comes to statues, I mean, I've written a biography of Richard III, very little reason why when you come to looking, for instance, at moral relativism here, why Richard's statue is still praised in Leicester, Cromwell in Parliament. I'm not saying they should be ripped down, but it becomes, splitting hairs argument then about sort of what we do with our relics for the past and what we look at them and how we want to frame them. The Edward Colston statue obviously was put up a century after his death. It's not particularly a great work of art, and there have been long discussions over decades about what to do with that statue. And I think it would have been better if we'd looked at how we could have made sure that it was able to be placed in a context to frame the slavery debate more effectively. But I think this is a tip of an iceberg. We focus on statues, but there are far more serious questions about potentially the erosion of the very discipline of history if we allow woke history to take hold.
Thank you very much, Chris. And if I could just make one small point, I could not agree with you more about the Colston thing. One of the most, if you like, unpleasant aspects of that was that I actually counted, because I'm a chemist, so I do this kind of thing. I'm afraid, sort of nitpicking. I counted the percentage of hands on the statue as it rolled down that were not white, and that was less than 20%, actually. And it seemed quite bizarre in a city where the highest civic authority is actually a black mayor. Nobody asked him. Anyway, I'm going to forego my own question, because we've actually got some, what I think are rather better questions than ones I would have asked you that have come in already. And I want to do this in two ways. First of all, I'm going to ask all of you a single question, which I'd like you to give a quick answer to. And then I've got a separate question for each of you, because some of them apply to each of the things you said. But the thing I want to ask all of you to respond to is that Peter has said this. President Macron of France has said, the French Republic will erase no trace or names of its history. It will forget none of its works. It will tear down none of the statues. We must instead lucidly look together at our history, and in particular, our relationship with Africa. And Peter asks, should there be a similar UK declaration from the government? Amanda.
Well, I thought there had been a similar declaration from the government saying that, in so many words, that is exactly what we should be doing, and that we cannot erase the past nor lie about it, and that history matters. But there's something which is slightly being missed here, which is that on the one hand, you have these statues and monuments and the context of these statues and monuments. And then on the other hand, you have the larger ideas and the larger narrative to which they are attached. And these are actually two different things. And this was vaguely mentioned, it was touched on with the Edward Colston statue because it was built 100 years after his death. Now, in the US, for example, we have a lot of, where I am right now, we have a lot of Confederate monuments. And there's a great debate about whether to keep them up or pull them down. And a lot of them have been pulled down in the wake of the George Floyd murder. And the point about many of these Confederate statues is that they weren't put up immediately after the war, or even 50 years after the war. They were put up in the early to mid 20th century in response to attempts to get rid of Jim Crow or segregation, or to bring in greater rights and political representation for African Americans. And so the very context of these Confederate monuments is itself politicized when they were put up and why they were put up, let alone to what they were referring to. So we have to be very careful. It is simply about attacking the mythology and history of a culture or a nation. It's also how, when, and why something was put up. But on the other hand, it's equally important to press upon this aspect of the heckler's veto and why it is so stupid to allow a few noisy, aggressive loudmouths to dictate the entire conversation of where and how and when and why we have these monuments. And to give you an example of just how stupid and moronic this course of action can go. In Wisconsin, in the state capital of Wisconsin, there are two very important statues right in front of the Capitol. The first is Forward, it's a statue of a woman, and the second is of an army officer called, get his name right, Hans Christian Hegg. Now, the Forward statue, both of these statues were torn down a couple of months ago. The Forward statue is actually, it was created and designed by a female sculptress, Jean Pond Minor, in the late 19th century, one of the early female artists. And it was to celebrate women's rights and progress, hence its name Forward. And it was a call and reminder to Wisconsin to remember its promise as a Western state that would not be like the East, it would not be conservative, it would be forward thinking. And the statue of Hans Christian Hegg celebrated him because he was an abolitionist who ran secret escape routes for slaves before the Civil War, and he died fighting in the Civil War as an abolitionist. So to the fact that the Black Lives Movement attacked those two statues was unbelievably idiotic, and they did it because they didn't like it or whatever. So this is what we're dealing with.
Tarjinder, should we have a national statement?
No, I don't think it's necessary, not when it comes to the national curriculum. I actually think Nick Gibbs' stance on this was really important because we already have enough flexibility. So number one, we don't actually know what's being taught. From my perspective. So until we get that research, I don't think we can make these grand claims about the idea that we're not looking at the past lucidly, actually. I don't see how we can make that claim. And then given the flexibility that already exists, surely there needs to be a debate within schools. And I think I kind of take Chris's point on this because actually part of the problem with this kind of woke agenda is that the one thing they don't want us to do is actually have that discussion within schools, within, sort of like, or between schools. They actually want it to be just what they want. And it's a case of trying to meet their demand. So I don't think it's an attempt to really look at the past. So I don't see how it can really inform what we're doing.
Chris, what do the issue of a single national statement of the kind that Macron proposes?
I'm actually in favour of it. I'm glad to see that Macron did it because he made a statement earlier about returning all artefacts back to Africa. and that was almost an opposite thing. I think it's important because, as Manders say, the voices of as Chris called them, work are much louder. They use social media well. They're much more, we talk about amplification, and I find the voices on the other side rather quiet. So it'd be rather useful to have louder and more proclaimed positions that say, which I think is the right thing to do, is that we mustn't judge people in the past by today's standards, because of course that kind of interpretation of the past always leaves us with a warm glow of moral superiority, mindful of how that interprets us in 100 years' time. So I do think it's important that in the public arena, positive statements are made public, and it's not left only to the ones who shout loudest.
Chris, would you be making a statement if you were still in your old job?
Yeah, I think it's not just about making a statement verbally, it's also about demonstrating action as a government to help underwrite and protect institutions. And that when it comes to protecting those institutions, we've heard about sort of decisions of having to be revisited because of just general instability and the issues not going away because of that vocal minority continuing to press. And when it comes to fairness, the government should step in to be able to protect institutions against vocal minorities, vexatious individuals. And so I think, therefore, when it comes to, looking at institutions and their funding levels, I think Oliver Dowden has already stated that sort of, institutions can be rest assured that, they're not going to be pressurised into decisions, because otherwise, actually, the government's not going to allow for certain funding streams to be activated. And, universities also, I think, need to think about what they do for funding. Obviously, the roads situation, the Roads Must Fall campaign, and what now the governing body is looking at or reinvestigating, is obviously a worrying precedent when it comes to donations. Obviously, in future donations may be under threat if individuals feel, well, this is the way an institution's going to treat me if I give money to finance its future. And I think that's where the government could, and certainly either through Cabinet Office, through this grants process, or even through finance, through the student finance process, look at saying to institutions, do not bend on these issues, do not fall under a pressure that doesn't need to be there. I think it is about having a confidence, isn't it? I think historically in the past, when we've seen confidence being eroded in the national heritage and in our national frameworks, whether it's in the Reformation, whether it's in Byzantium, you see then sort of identities being created out of negative identities rather than positive identities, and having that positive affirmation and a statement about our future and how we work together. And that, I truly support Black History Month, because I also feel that sort of that is something that works to demonstrate how we came together as a multi-racial, diverse community. And so therefore having that inclusive opportunity to demonstrate rather than divide, I think having a statement, but also protecting institutions to make them stand themselves.
Okay, I've got one question for each of you, looking at the list that's been put in. I'm going to ask each of you to take no more than a minute, if you wouldn't mind, because otherwise Zoom will drop us. Samir, there's a question which I guess could be summed up. I'm going to embarrass myself here because my Latin is just absolute crap. But I think this comes down to quis judicat. Who decides? Who decides on any of these things? You said, Samir, that we should, but perhaps you might say something about how you think decisions get made. Taj, one of the questions that's been raised in relation to what you said is the extent to which activists have grabbed the agenda. And I think you've been asked, and somebody's talked about this being bullying. How did it get like this, and how do we get past it? Amanda, I wonder if you might take on a question which has been asked, which I think is a rather interesting one. Conservatives, shouldn't patriots and conservatives really be concerned not so much with what gets taken down, but whether there's a case for putting up new statues to new heroes and so on, and would that be a Conservative way forward? And Robert, a wider question of the same stamp, which is, can Conservatives engage with arguments about identity which underlie all of this debate? And if so, how? So, Samir, kick off. Who decides? You're muted. You're muted.
So I think I would be concerned about the process. For example, in my work, in the museum world, the decision, the sovereign body, as it were, is the Board of Trustees, and I think they're the right people to decide. But I think we should have a process which is established about how decisions are arrived at. So, for example, if we are talking, let's say, for the purpose of this argument, taking down a statue, this is a decision that will be irreversible, and therefore must be a decision that can stand the test of time and is not the result of some movement of the moment. So what kind of decision, how do you do that? Now, maybe that you take a proper, rigorous consultation of the taxpayer, because the taxpayer is the person who's paying for this museum, and to do a proper, detailed, rigorous examination so we know what they think. And you create a series of steps that mean that the decision you finally come to has rigorously investigated the positions taken by different stakeholders, as it were, and then the board comes to an independent decision of what to do. I think it's just that at the moment there is no clear process, which I certainly could have gone down and said, well, we can't do it like this or we can't do it like that, because if you want to adjust a grade 1 listed building, here is a process by which you can come to a decision. And we didn't have that. So we were buffeted by all sides. But I think we need to lay down a rigorous process that stands up to the test of time. That means it can go either way, by the way. I'm not kind of hooked on just one answer, but it needs to be rigorous and be durable.
Okay, so not so much, I don't know what the right word is, statuette, maybe, the body that decides, but actually a process. Tarjinder, what about this issue of the activist hegemony, I guess would be the word that Dean Godson, Director of Policy Exchange, would use?
I think to some extent, funnily enough, I think Black History Month actually, where it was taught, fed into some of these ideas and the notions of tokenism and black and white history as opposed to a wider history curriculum. I think certainly the skills-based curriculum that was being taught for a very long time did not help because it was so knowledge light. So again, it reinforced this idea. And a kind of lack of parental and community involvement in terms of teaching people from ethnic minorities their own background. It seems to me there's a vast difference between what my parents and my community did at the time when I was a child and what's going on now, if the claims are to be believed. I think social media as well, just the fact that it's amplified certain voices. And if you are a bit of a bully, actually, you can get away with it on the internet in a way that you can't elsewhere. So this sort of threat to people's ability to speak via social media, threat to their jobs, has meant that these activists have been able to gain quite a lot of ground. I think in terms of getting past it, I think the government has already done quite a few things that have been really helpful. The reinforcement of the requirements of the 1996 Education Act, for example, and the need for teacher political neutrality, teaching balanced perspectives, is actually really vital, I think, because there was, this kind of threat, I think, over the summer that certain curriculums could just simply be changed so that a different narrative would be taught altogether. So I think it's important that that we have that reinforcement against activists, that while they can be activists and argue certain things, actually they can't just override schools or teachers or get involved in that kind of shaming of teachers. There is actually a cause for us to sort of have that debate internally as well. And also, I think, genuinely, we do need to find a range of solutions. I think we can't just keep focusing on the history curriculum and allowing activists to do that. I think it's time that it was pushed back onto them in terms of them creating the kind of curriculum they think that would be ideal and arguing for it from a historical perspective, which we then make decisions on. And also to find a range of solutions, sort of where are the parents, where are the community in this, and what can they do to support this? So I think it's about us having that debate, whether they wish to engage or not, but making sure that our voices are still heard.
Thank you, Amanda. Should we switch focus to the new rather than what's sitting there?
I did understand why it has to be an either or. That in a healthy society, we have both. And sometimes by focusing on the old, you see something new out of it, and vice versa. So whatever happens, when we think about the monuments that we're doing and why we're doing it, it mustn't be reduced to any kind of party political debate. It is something much wider, and it has to do with our emotions, our memories, our shared culture, and our, as you say, the constellations that we look into the sky to help us tell stories about ourselves. And we're perfectly capable of putting up old statues done in new ways, and new, as it were, or statues to previous generations, but done in an entirely new way. And the converse, something done in a new way to new ideas or new subjects, but done in a very traditional way. And the two it all goes very nicely together. And it's simply that so far this year, these debates have been poisoned by something outside of the thing itself, which is the preservation of memory.
Thank you. Chris, I have a rather boring metaphor for some of what's happening in politics, which is that in my lifetime, if you think of politics as a car, there have been two people in the front, and one is called economics, the other one is called culture or identity. And in my lifetime, economics has always had its hand on the steering wheel. Right now, it looks like actually there isn't a massive division on, for example, spending and so on between different political parties, but there are different ideas about culture and identity. So the steering wheel is pretty much in the hands of identity. And it would be easy for conservatives simply to say, we're conservatives, we're here to conserve what is. But my guess is, I mean, I'm not a member of the Conservative Party, but my feeling is that that isn't where the Conservative Party is, and that lots of people in the Conservative Party do want to engage with thinking about what that identity is, but hasn't quite found a way to understand this, articulate a position, or even to reach one. Is that a fair description of the situation? And if it is anyway fair, what would you do?
I think for myself, when I came in 2010, I was probably one of the initial Red Wall seats, having won my constituency off the Labour Party then rather unexpectedly. And I think what we've seen is a Conservative Party that's obviously been on a journey. It's been sort of turbocharged in a way through the Brexit process that has obviously created this sort of polarised dynamic. And the traditional axes, as it were, of politics, partly when it comes to spending, the economic debate, partly when it comes particularly to the cultural debate. I think we've seen the Conservative Party really keen now to make a power grab on the left. The original cultural bastions of the left and the Labour Party, and what we've seen obviously is the Labour Party's institution begin to splinter, and the Conservative Party recognising some of those seats, those working class heritage seats, that there is an opportunity to focus on identity and focus on belonging and focus on issues that those communities might felt sort of left behind as the left has, or a certain vocal element of the left has got more and more woke and decided that they will play to issues that aren't particularly relevant politically to these individuals across most of the country. So the Conservative Party, I think, sees a distinct advantage in trying to beat the antithesis of this. And I think we've seen that's why there's been such a prominent play on cultural issues going forwards. And so this is a live issue. What I would I send out a plea though, is that when it comes to that erosion of collective memory, that you can contrast it with France. They've always seen significant investment into the past in ways that we haven't, regardless of whichever political party, over the past sort of 50 years, either in sort of institutions that cover in particular disciplines like history, but our record offices. And I will say that sort of tangentially, that we've got a long way to go to be like France in actually being proud of our heritage and taking that point, maybe a National Heritage Act that would work in the same way as the Town and Country Planning Act did in 24 to look on to go and establish the Green Belt. We've done very well as a country in shielding our environmental heritage. how do we look to preserve our wider heritage for the future? I think there is a strong constituency there to play for if the Conservative Party wishes to. You just
I know that I'm a sort of a neutral chairman, though it's not a role that I'm used to filling. Somebody wrote to me to say to get off the fence today. I was rather pleased by that, because I think my reputation is usually as somebody who takes an axe to the fence rather than sits on it. But I found this conversation really a positive one, in the sense that I think, as Amanda was implying right at the very beginning, the polarization around some of these issues isn't really left-right polarization. It's, in my view, a sort of not thinking polarization and a thought against the thoughtful. And I think my concern has been, in the last year or so, that the thoughtful is losing ground to the people who basically want to sloganize and want action now, irrespective of what it means, or indeed whether, as you say, you're pulling down the right statue, or indeed the statue of somebody who's done what you think they've done. Actually, there's been an enormous amount of silliness and, even worse, I think, misrepresentation around all of this, which has prevented us starting to think sensibly in the way that all of you have been trying, I think, to urge. I must say I'm quite attracted to the idea of some kind of statute of the national heritage act that gives us a process by which we can debate these issues, not necessarily that determines an outcome, but it constrains the debate so that these things are not decided by mob or by those who shout loudest, because inevitably what ends up being kept is that which has most money. And actually, I think a lot of those people who are on the radical, progressive, stroke woke side, I think may come to regret getting what they want, which is that the authorities just bow to those who can exercise the greatest pressure. I myself think that is the worst possible pathway for any democracy. This will be an extremely important and live issue for Policy Exchange over the next 12 months and probably beyond. Our History Matters project will continue to publish data, news, periodically, as frequently as we can. We also intend to continue discussions of this kind to try to see if we can come up with ideas that everybody can get behind to help us find a way through this. Because I think every sensible person knows that we can't keep things exactly as they are, and nobody particularly wants that. But we do need to find a way in which everybody can agree how we do understand our past, how we draw in it, and how we build on it, and how it helps us to understand our present and chart a future. So I just want to say thank you to our 4 excellent speakers and to everybody who has been tuned in. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.